Welcome to Inquiry with Google Workspace. My name is Stefani Boutelier, and I'm an Associate Professor of Education at Aquinas College.
And I am Susan Hojnacki. I am an Assistant Professor of German and Language Education at Aquinas College as well. Welcome. So we are going to talk to you about the process of ongoing inquiry and what that looks like in various different content areas, as well as online tools, specifically Google Suite tools that you can use to support that type of learning.
And this presentation and the topics all support multiple ISTE standards, including the Designer Standard, Facilitator, and Analyst.
So a few definitions, just so we're all on the same page as we go through. The process of inquiry in education is the idea of sort of collaborative learning between the instructor and the students, in which students are pursuing a specific question. It's inquiry-based learning rather than presenting a set of facts as the instructor. We use the skill of inquiry to ask questions, pursue interests, and look at curiosity to drive the learning. And this tends to make the learning and the student involvement much more relevant, makes the learning stick much better, and encourages students to develop their own independent learning skills. We talk about ongoing inquiry, in which the process is very cyclical or iterative. So students start by posing questions and doing research and presenting their findings, which circles back to sort of a continuing process of constantly asking questions. And we are specifically looking at how you can support this type of learning in a virtual environment, since many of us have transitioned to virtual learning throughout the COVID 2020 year.
We'll be talking about different tools from Google Workspace. And yes, it is transitioning to Google Workspace instead of G Suite for Education. Please know that you will have access to this slide deck at the end of our presentation, and anything that you see that is underlined and colored red, you can open on your own and access additional support to use Google with inquiry. Some of the Google apps that we'll be discussing are your Google Drive, Docs, Sheets, Forms, Slides, Jamboard, Gmail, Meet, Chat, Classroom, Keep, and Calendar. Wow. That's a lot, Susan. But please keep in mind that we will be going through this and giving you brief tips, but the goal for you is to use the inquiry process and expand your own use of inquiry with your students or your children in multiple modes of learning.
Another thing we wanted to point out is that we are going to throw a heck of a lot of technology at you throughout this presentation because we want you to see the different options that are out there. But in general, we recommend not overloading your students with multiple different tools unless they have had the training to know how to work with those tools. So kind of picking one, working with it, seeing how it works, and then using that with your students until they're very comfortable with it, and then adding a new tool after that. So not overloading the students with having to complete a task and learn a new tool all at the same time.
And even though our focus today is on the Google apps, we do want to make sure that you know that there are Chrome extensions and Chrome add-ons. And just a brief overview, a Google add-on is app specific. So you would find in a Google Slides something such as Pear Deck, which can help make your slide deck interactive. And then Chrome extensions connect directly to the Chrome browser. And that supports different modes such as reading text out loud or citations.
Okay, so we'll also be talking about various different modes of instruction. Many of you have had to transition to a different mode that you may not have been familiar with before. We've all had to make adjustments in our teaching due to COVID. So obviously the face-to-face is the traditional classroom that we're used to, but in this day and age, in these uncertain times, our face-to-face is even different. So our students might be socially distanced from each other or wearing masks. So the hybrid format would be a split. Maybe you're meeting part of the time face-to-face, part of the time online. The high flex model, many of us are using now, in which some of our students are in the classroom with us while some are accessing the classroom from online. So we're running maybe a Google Meet or a Zoom meeting simultaneously while we also work with students in the classroom. And for the online component, we differentiate between synchronous, in which we are meeting in real time, sort of like a Zoom meet where everybody is present in the same time in that Zoom meeting, whereas asynchronous online learning is where the material is present online and people make use of it on their own time, which is what you would be doing with this presentation.
We've used the Common Core Cafe inquiry process with 4 steps, and we've remixed it to support how that might look with Google Workspace. So step 1 would be posing questions. Step 2 would be finding resources. Step 3 is interpretation and the iteration process. And the final step of the ongoing inquiry process would be your findings and the competency.
So within this process, if you are teaching with ongoing inquiry, your role as an instructor becomes much more about the design of the lessons. So you become much more of an instructional designer. While you're still teaching the class, a lot of the work being done is to support the students in that process. So it becomes much more important how you set the lessons up, what your lesson plans and unit plans look like. And we recommend, in order to do that, using the understanding by design process, or the backward design process of beginning with the outcomes you want your students to develop, stepping back from that to say, how will I know if they've developed those outcomes? So that would be your assessment. What type of assessment will you give, both formative and summative, to see where your students are at the different steps along the way? And then to say, how do I want my students to be able to be successful on those assessments? That is going to be your instructional strategies. And that would be this inquiry process where students are posing questions, doing research, and presenting their results. Both of those links there will show you both that template and some examples of the inquiry-based learning. And some of the tools you can use for that would be Google Docs for your lesson plans, spreadsheets, or drawings for the students to start the questioning process. Part of what we really base these lessons on are what we call big ideas or essential questions. And a lot of times finding the right essential question or big idea can drive that whole inquiry process. All of these links take you to places that will give you examples. These questions might be different based on the age level of your students and the content area, but sometimes, for example, in the science area, it might be, how clean is the water in our community? That's a very big idea, but how can students pursue that question even in different ways for different students and still meet the standards that you're looking for as far as what students know about water quality? So these are giant lists of lots of big ideas and essential questions that might help you think about what that would look like in your classroom.
Great, thank you, Susan. Now we're going to go through each of the 4 steps and give you some ideas of how it might look in your classroom. So step 1 of the 4-step process would be posing questions. So one way you can do this is by using Jamboard. Jamboard can be found in your Google Waffle, which is often in the top right of your Gmail account or other apps. And here's one question for you to think about. What does inquiry-based learning look like in your content and grade level? We did this recently with a group of educators in Michigan, and you can see the screenshot here gives some examples of what it might look like in their course. So for example, one teacher said, for health, what shapes your identity? It's a very broad question that you can start with to pose. Or for history, what can we learn about prudence and fortitude from the colonialists and revolutionaries? So you have a wide variety of areas and angles that you can go to with your initial questions. And Jamboard is a great tool for collaborating. So you can see here from the tool aspect, you can use Post-its, digital Post-its, text, and images.
So as we go through this process, the 4 steps of the inquiry process, we will pause at each level and have you think about or consider, how would you have students pose questions in your classes, in your subject matter area, at your grade level area, thinking about how would you get students to really pose good questions, because a good starting question will drive that whole process. And thinking about how might you do that in the different formats or modes in which you are teaching. So Jamboard, for example, is a good example of how you get students to collaborate on that questioning phase, even if you're not all in the same physical space.
Step 2, finding resources. And once the students are posed with questions, whether that's a question that they've designed or one that you've posed to them, they'll need to go out and start researching and exploring that question. So with Google, here are two resources that maybe you hadn't heard of before that you might be able to support or provide to your students. The first one is Google Trends. On Google Trends, you can look at comparisons. So if you'll notice, here's a comparison of how often the word synchronous or asynchronous was searched over the last 12 months. And you'll notice towards the end of the summer, it was starting to go up a little bit more as schools probably trended towards figuring out and identifying these terms for all the parents and students around the world. Another tool that you can use, obviously Google search is a browser and it's used all the time, but many people are not aware of the advanced search feature. And this is really helpful to make sure that your students or your children are accessing resources via Google that are really identifying what they're looking for, and also ones that are can be legally used or are research-based or authentic. A few other things to consider for when they're finding resources is using cognitive mapping to support their thinking process. So Google Drawings is a great app for cognitive maps or mind maps. Jamboard also works well. And then also creating tables in docs or sheets is very beneficial to get that inquiry process to be organized for your students and your children during the inquiry process.
So for this step as well, we would pause and think, have you maybe consider or write down, in order to take something away from this presentation within your learning context, how would you help your students find resources in the modes in which you are learning, in which you're instructing or your students are learning? So in the face-to-face mode, are you a one-to-one district? Do students have access to devices so that they can search resources? Or do you go to a physical media center for your students to find those resources? If you're hybrid, can you have students collaborate on the finding resources step, maybe by creating a mind map together in Drawings or Jamboard or a Google Doc? In that high flex, you may have some students in the classroom doing research one way. You may have students at home finding resources another way. Can you connect them with the Google Meet so that they can work together even though they're not in the same space, so that those at-home students aren't so isolated from the in-class students? And can they work both synchronously and asynchronously, so maybe collecting information onto a Jamboard even at different times so that everybody can access that information?
The third step is interpreting their information. So as they go through this process, they have a question, then they were finding resources and brainstorming where to go next, and then they have to make meaning of it. So we have a few suggestions of how you might do this. Slides and a slide deck that are used for journaling or collaboration are great resources to make meaning. You can pose questions, have templates ready for these 4 steps for them to share out. Other collaborative tools that we've already mentioned would still be Jamboard and Drawings and Google Docs. You might also consider using shared notes if they're working together, or even sharing their notes out with others, even if the questions differ. If you haven't been familiarized with HyperDocs yet, there's some great resources with HyperDocs. We've provided 2 here that you can explore on your own, but HyperDocs can help you through the entire process of ongoing inquiry. And then Pear Deck or other add-ons and Chrome extensions can also support this meaning making as they move forward.
Is that me? For reflection, so once they have that information and they've kind of organized that information, they're making meaning out of it. Reflection is a huge part of this process. Thinking about what they found can be a bit of a formative assessment piece as well. So asking them to reflect on what they found. Google Forms are a great way to do this. Asking them to give you making their thought process visual on what they've already found. So self-reflection, reflection that you can see, goal setting. Google Forms is a great way to get that information.
And you'll see in this example to the right, this is just one basic template of how you might pose the self-reflection piece with your students if you're using this 4-step model for inquiry. And then here are 2 examples of how you might use Google Forms to have students self-assess. So if you are using a rubrics-based guidance for the inquiry process, you can use Google Forms to have actual grades or points listed over here on the left. And then over on the right, if you're not using a point system, you can identify and share the rubric directly in the Google form and have the student identify if they feel like they're below, sufficient, or above. So these are just different ways to use Google Forms for self-assessment and self-reflection.
Okay, so again, thinking about that interpretation piece in the different modes, similar to making meaning, interpreting, how can you have students self-reflect? We showed you Google Forms, but using those different tools, thinking about at your level, stop for a moment to consider how would you have your students then interpret and reflect on all of the information that they find, constantly circling back to those big ideas and essential questions.
And finally, step 4 is report findings. So here we have a few more examples of what you can use in Google Workspace to have students demonstrate their competency or report out what they found. Google Drawings again, but 2 new ones would be Blogger, where they can interact and communicate with maybe a smaller team or a larger authentic audience, or have them create a Google site to share out their information. You also can use add-ons and extensions to further support, for example, using Screencastify, which would record their thinking. Similar to what we're doing here, Screencastify could have been used to share someone's screen and put their image on there to describe their thinking as well.
So this step is really where you started in the backward course design, which is, what kind of knowledge, skills, competencies do you want students to have developed by the end of this lesson or unit? Here's where you want students to demonstrate that to you. So stopping to consider at the different age level and content area levels where your students are working, how can they demonstrate to you what they know and are able to do? So we really like to focus on that type of outcome rather than a set of facts that every single student in your class knows and you're testing them on. Rather, put it on to the students to use some form of media to show you what they know and are able to do. And again, they can collaborate on that with a lot of these tools, even if they're in different physical spaces from you or each other. They can create things online with these collaborative tools in order to show you what they know and are able to do. And it's great for them to use drawings, to record videos, to make podcasts, to make movies, animated. There's so many tools out there now, and the students are so good at using those tools to create creative things. They do this all the time on their own, online with their friends. So harnessing some of that creative energy to have them create even social media posts about what they've learned is a great way to harness, you know, the way that they're used to expressing themselves and bringing that into your learning.
And that's all we have for you today. So we've gone through the 4 steps: pose questions, find resources, interpret the information, and then share findings. We went through a lot of information, and hopefully you can pause and access the slide deck. And if you have further questions about any of this, feel free to email us. And you can access the slide deck by going to any browser and typing in the bit.ly/inquiry workspace that you see at the bottom of this slide. Good luck with all of your teaching and learning.
Thanks for joining us, and I hope that you can use some of this inquiry process with your students. Let us know how it turns out.